In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west from the port of Palos, Spain, and history decided that a new world had been found. That story has been told so many times, in so many languages, across so many centuries, that it feels like bedrock, undeniable, settled. It is not settled. 500 years before Columbus loaded his 3 ships, Norse sailors had already crossed the Atlantic, stepped onto North American soil, built structures, lit fires, hammered iron, and tried to stay. They failed. They left. And then, somehow, the entire world forgot they had ever been there. That forgetting is not an accident. It is not a mystery of lost records. It is something stranger and more revealing than that, because the evidence was always there. It was buried in soil, encoded in ice, written in sagas that scholars dismissed as legend for 900 years. And when the proof finally surfaced, in 1960, in a muddy field on the northern tip of Newfoundland, it did not just confirm a Viking voyage. It broke open a question that most people still have not fully reckoned with. Who really discovered America? And why does the answer change everything we think we know about how history gets written? Keep watching, because by the end of this video, the story of Columbus will look completely different. And the story of the people who actually got there first will be even stranger. Let's go back, not to 1492, to a world 5 centuries before that, when the Atlantic was not a highway but a wall. The year is roughly 874 CE. A group of Norse settlers, following rumors and the logic of ocean winds, reaches a volcanic island in the North Atlantic. They call it Iceland. They build farms. They survive brutal winters. Within a century, Iceland is home to tens of thousands of Norse people, a functioning society at the western edge of the known world. That matters more than it seems, because Iceland is not the end of the Norse expansion. It is the beginning of a chain. That chain starts with a murder. Around 982 CE, a man named Erik Thorvaldsson, known to history as Erik the Red, is banished from Iceland. Not for the first time. He had already been exiled from Norway for manslaughter before arriving in Iceland. Now he has killed again, and the Icelandic Assembly, the Althing, sentences him to 3 years of exile. There is nowhere to go except west, into ocean that no Norse sailor had crossed. Erik did not find nothing. He found a vast, ice-fringed island. He spent 3 years exploring it, named it Greenland, a marketing decision as deliberate as anything in the modern era, designed to attract settlers. When his exile ended, he returned to Iceland and convinced a convoy of 25 ships to follow him back. 11 of those ships survived the crossing. Around 985 CE, the Norse Greenland colonies were born. 2 settlements eventually housed between 3,000 and 5,000 people. Farms, churches, trade. A functioning European civilization planted at the edge of the world. But here is where the chain gets its final link. Around 986 CE, a Norse merchant named Bjarni was sailing from Iceland to Greenland to visit his father when storms blew him off course. He saw a coastline he did not recognize, forested, flat. Definitely not the glaciers of Greenland. He did not land. He turned around and reported what he had seen. And for years, the Norse world sat with that information. Lands to the west, wooded, real. Leif Erikson, son of Erik the Red, bought Bjarni's ship and retraced the course in reverse. Around the year 1000 CE, he landed in North America. Not stumbled upon it, planned it, sought it out. The stepping stone chain from Norway to Iceland to Greenland to America took over 100 years to complete. It was not a single act of courage. It was a civilization systematically pressing west, generation by generation, following the logic of wind and water and the simple human drive to know what lies beyond the edge. And then for 900 years, the world decided it had not happened. Here is why it was dismissed so easily. The primary sources for the Norse voyages to America are two Icelandic sagas, the Saga of the Greenlanders and Erik the Red Saga. They describe Leif Erikson sailing west from Greenland and landing in three distinct regions: Helluland, meaning flat stone land, likely Baffin Island; Markland, meaning forest land, likely the coast of Labrador; and Vinland, meaning wineland or vineland, likely Newfoundland or somewhere south of it. These sagas were oral traditions passed down for generations before being written down in the 13th century. By the time European scholars encountered them in the modern era, the default assumption was legend, myth, the embellished boasting of a warrior culture. For 900 years, these documents sat in archives, while Columbus was celebrated in every schoolbook on Earth. Then, a single nut changed everything. In 1960, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Steiningstad were following leads from Old Norse texts, moving along the northeastern coast of North America, asking local fishermen and farmers whether they knew of any unusual old runes. At a place called Meadows, on the northern peninsula of Newfoundland, Canada, a local man named George Decker pointed to a series of grassy mounds near the water. The Ingstads began today. What they found was not a legend. It was a settlement. 8 turf-built structures, the style of construction identical to Norse buildings in Iceland and Greenland. A smithy, with iron slag still present, proving that ironworking had been done on site. A carpentry workshop, Norse-style artifacts, a ringed pin, identical to ones found in Scandinavia. A small, carved stone object. Carbon dating placed the occupation at approximately 1000 CE, 492 years before Columbus. But the detail that stopped archaeologists cold was not the smithy or the artifacts. It was a collection of butternuts, a type of nut whose nearest natural habitat is New Brunswick or Maine, hundreds of miles south of Newfoundland. Someone at Meadows had traveled far down the American coastline, gathered those nuts, and brought them back to the settlement. The sagas had not lied. The Norse had not just touched North America. They had explored it. The site could have housed between 70 and 90 people. It had food storage, workshops, sleeping quarters. This was not a temporary camp thrown up by sailors, sheltering from a storm. And then there was the Spindle-Whorl. A Spindle-Whorl is a small, round, weighted disc used for spinning wool into thread. It is a domestic tool. You do not bring a Spindle-Whorl on a raiding expedition. You bring one when you are planning to stay, when you are planning to build a life. Someone at Meadows had packed for a future. Women had made this crossing. This was an attempted settlement, not an adventure. The Norse were not visiting America. They were trying to keep it. What do you think actually ended the Viking colony in North America? Was it the numbers? The distance? Something else entirely? Drop your answer in the comments below, because the real reason is not what most people expect. The Norse had advantages that should have made them unstoppable. They had iron. The indigenous peoples of northeastern North America in 1000 CE did not have iron weapons or tools. In military terms, that gap is enormous. A Norse sword does not just cut differently than a stone blade. It represents an entirely different material technology, and yet the Norse did not last a decade. The sagas call the indigenous peoples Skraelings, a word that probably meant something like barbarians or foreigners. Initial contact, described in the sagas, was cautious but commercial. The Norse traded red cloth for furs. The Skraelings had never seen metal, and they were fascinated by it. For a brief window, it appeared that coexistence was possible. Then something went wrong. The sagas describe an incident where a Norse bull charged out of the woods and terrified a group of Skraelings. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The Skraelings attacked the settlement with forces the Norse had not anticipated. The Norse fought back. People died on both sides, and then the arithmetic of the situation became impossible to ignore. The Norse at Lens ou Meadows numbered, at most, 90 people. The North American continent behind them, in 1000 CE, held an estimated 10 million people. Dozens of complex civilizations, trade networks stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, sophisticated agriculture in some regions, advanced hunting cultures in others. The Norse had found the edge of a world they could not begin to imagine. Think about what that actually means. The Norse did not land on an empty continent. They landed on the doorstep of one of the most populated and complex regions on Earth, with the resources of a tiny farming colony. Iron weapons are devastating in a battle between two armies of comparable size. They are irrelevant when you are 90 people against 10 million. The colony was abandoned, the Atlantic closed, and the Norse retreated to Greenland and Iceland, taking their knowledge of Western lands with them. But here's the question that never gets asked. What if they had stayed? This is not a fantasy. It is a calculation. And the numbers are staggering. A Norse foothold in North America, established in 1000 CE and sustained, would have meant European contact with the Americas 492 years earlier than 1492. By 1492, that colony would have been nearly 5 centuries old. It would have had 5 centuries to grow, to trade, to adapt, to spread. The entire trajectory of human civilization would have been different. The Norse had no horses in America, but they had ships. They had iron, but not enough of it. They had the knowledge to build more settlements, but not enough people to defend them. What they needed was a continuous supply line from Greenland, and that supply line depended on the Greenland colonies remaining healthy. We will come back to why that matters, because it is the most important detail in this entire story. For now, hold this question. If the Norse colony had survived and grown, when would European disease have reached the indigenous populations of America? Not in 1492, when it killed an estimated 90% of the population within a century, but in 1000 CE, 500 years earlier. The mathematics of that alternate history are almost impossible to process. Either the disease arrives earlier and kills earlier, reshaping civilization on a faster timeline, or 5 centuries of gradual contact builds partial immunity across indigenous populations, changing the scale of the catastrophe entirely. Either way, every map of the modern world looks different. Whoever controls the map controls the world. The Norse held the map first, and that map was about to become the most valuable secret in Europe. This is a good time to subscribe, if you haven't already. This channel covers exactly this kind of deep history. The stories underneath the stories. The facts that the textbooks quietly skipped. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because what comes next in this story is the part that most historians find genuinely uncomfortable. The Norse colony was abandoned, but the knowledge of Western lands did not die with it. In 1075 CE, a German scholar and cleric named Adam of Bremen wrote a text called the Gesta Hamburgensis Ecclesiae Pontificum, a history of the archbishops of Hamburg. In it, He recorded a conversation with the Danish king Svein Estridsson, who told him about an island far to the west of Greenland, discovered in the Norse Ocean, which many call Vinland because vines grow there naturally, producing the best wine. He was not speculating. He was recording established knowledge from a Scandinavian king. That text was written in 1075. It was read by scholars across Europe. The knowledge circulated. Norse geographical understanding of the Atlantic, including the existence of land far to the west, was embedded in European scholarly and ecclesiastical networks for centuries before Columbus was born. And Columbus knew it. In 1477, 15 years before his famous voyage, Christopher Columbus sailed to Iceland. He was a young, ambitious Genoese sailor, already obsessed with the idea of a western sea route to Asia. He went to Iceland for trade, certainly, but also, almost certainly, to talk to sailors, to hear what the Norse Atlantic world knew about what lay to the west. Norse sailors in the late 15th century still carried oral traditions about Vinland, about lands beyond Greenland, about coastlines that were not Asia. Columbus spoke to people who knew things that European mapmakers had not yet committed to parchment. And there is one more detail that is almost too specific to be coincidence. In 1492, the same year Columbus set sail, Pope Alexander VI assigned a bishop to the Norse diocese of Greenland. The Catholic Church, in the year of the supposed discovery, was actively administering a diocese that existed because Norse sailors had been navigating the far North Atlantic for 5 centuries. The Church did not think the Western Atlantic was empty. It thought it was Norse territory. Do you think Columbus knew about the Norse voyages before he sailed? The evidence we have just covered suggests something much more deliberate than a lucky accident. Drop your answer below. This is one of the most genuinely contested questions in all of historical scholarship, and the answers people give say a lot about how they think history actually works. But here is the part that rewrites everything. The contact between Norse civilization and North America did not end when the ships left Meadows. The ocean did not close. It got quieter, much quieter. But the evidence of what continued is written not in sagas or archaeology, but in something no one can fake. In 2021, scientists analyzing the genomes of Icelandic people published findings in the journal Nature that stopped the academic world cold. They found Native American DNA in Icelandic family trees, dating to approximately 1000 CE. A woman, a real human being, whose ancestors had lived in North America for thousands of years, made it to Iceland around the time of Leif Erikson's voyages. Read that again. A Native American woman, or a woman with Native American ancestry, crossed the Atlantic in the year 1000 CE and integrated into Icelandic society deeply enough to leave a genetic signal that survives to this day. She was almost certainly not the only one. She is simply the one whose lineage happened to be traceable by modern genomics. The Norse contact with North America produced biological exchange, not just trade goods and conflict. The two worlds touched each other at a cellular level. Additional genetic analysis of Canadian Arctic populations, including the Dorset culture and later Thule peoples who the Norse encountered in Greenland, shows limited but real genetic overlap consistent with contact across multiple generations. The Norse and the indigenous peoples of the North Atlantic world were not simply trading and fighting. They were, in small and quiet ways, becoming part of each other. This is the piece of the story that demolishes the simple narrative. The Vikings did not just arrive, fail, and leave. They left a trace in the bodies of people on both sides of the ocean. And that trace has been sitting inside living human beings for 1,000 years, waiting for the science to catch up. Now hold all of that, because the story takes one final turn. And this one is about ice. The Norse Greenland colonies were the launch pad for everything. Without Greenland, there is no stepping stone to North America. Erik the Red's settlement, begun around 985 CE, eventually housed several thousand people. They farmed, they raised cattle, they exported walrus ivory to Europe, a commodity worth more in the medieval world than almost anything else. They were prosperous. They were also farming at the absolute northern edge of what European agricultural methods could sustain. Around 1300 CE, the climate began to change. Not dramatically, not with catastrophe visible from space. The average temperature in the North Atlantic dropped by less than 2 degrees Celsius. 2 degrees. That was enough. The Norse in Greenland farmed the way they had always farmed, the way their ancestors had farmed in Iceland and Norway. Crops that had grown through warm summers now struggled through shorter, cooler seasons. Cattle that had grazed on open land now starved through longer winters. The sea ice expanded. European trade ships stopped making the crossing. Not because anyone decided to abandon Greenland, but because the routes became too dangerous and too unprofitable. The Norse Greenlanders watched their supply lines disappear. They watched their farms fail. And they refused to change. Here is the counterintuitive part. The Norse were not failed by weakness. They were failed by rigidity. Living alongside them in Greenland, and in the same Arctic conditions, were the Inuit. The Thule people, ancestors of modern Inuit, had arrived in Greenland from the west around the same time the climate was beginning to cool. They had a completely different suite of survival technologies. Warm clothing made from sea mammal skins, harpoon techniques for hunting in ice-covered water, housing designs that retained body heat through brutal winters. The Norse would not adopt these methods. Not fully. They were European farmers. That was who they were. That was the identity that had carried them across the ocean in the first place. And that identity would not bend to the ice. The last recorded event in Norse Greenland is a wedding. In September 1408, a marriage ceremony was performed at Falsey Church. The records note the names of the witnesses. The church still stands today, in ruins, on the Greenland coast. After 1408, there is silence. No more records, no ships returning, no letters, no archaeology of continued habitation. Somewhere between 1408 and the mid-1400s, the Norse Greenland colonies simply ended. The people died, fled, or were absorbed. No one in Europe came looking. No rescue ships were sent. The Black Death had devastated European populations from 1347 onward, reducing the manpower and economic capacity for distant Atlantic voyaging. The Greenland colonies went silent, and a continent full of plague survivors barely noticed. Think about what that actually means for the story we have been telling. The civilization that discovered America was erased by a temperature drop of less than 2 degrees Celsius. The stepping stones went dark. The knowledge held in Norse oral tradition, in sailing routes, in the institutional memory of 3,000 people living at the edge of the known world, all of it evaporated. Not because of war, not because of conquest, because of ice and cultural stubbornness and a plague that killed a third of Europe. And then, 84 years later, Columbus sailed west from Spain and called it a discovery. This is the reframe that the history books have been slow to absorb. Columbus was not sailing into the unknown. He was sailing into a silence that the Norse had already made. He was looking for something that European scholarly and maritime tradition had been quietly describing for 400 years. He arrived on a continent whose existence was already documented in the archives of the Catholic Church, in the writings of Adam of Bremen, in the genetic memory of Icelandic families, whether Columbus knew exactly what he was looking for, or whether he was pursuing a theory that happened to confirm what Norse sailors had known for half a millennium, the outcome was identical. He claimed the discovery. He got the credit. History wrote his name on the continent, because history is not written by the victors. It is written by whoever controls the narrative at the moment the narrative is fixed. And in 1492, the Norse civilization that had actually found America was cold and silent in the ice of Greenland. They could not contest the claim. They were gone. Now go back to the beginning of this story, to the object that mattered most. The Spindle-Whorl, that small carved disc found in the ruins of Meadows, a tool for spinning wool, a domestic object, the kind of thing you pack when you are planning a future, not a raid. Someone carried that object across the Atlantic Ocean around the year 1000 CE, through storms, through weeks of open sea, to a continent they had never seen. She arrived. She spun her wool. She tried to build something permanent on the edge of a world that was not ready to receive her. The Norse did not fail because they were too primitive. They were not primitive. They were extraordinary navigators, skilled ironworkers, capable of building and sustaining civilizations at the extreme edge of what the medieval world could imagine. They failed because they were too few, too far from home, too culturally rigid to adapt when the climate turned against them. The woman who packed that Spindle-Whorl was not naive. She was brave in the purest sense. She committed to a future without knowing whether it would exist. The settlement she helped build lasted perhaps 5 years, perhaps 10. And then the ships went home, and the Atlantic swallowed the evidence, and the world moved on without her. The last Norse Greenlander, whoever that was, died around 1408 in a stone church on an island being slowly encased in ice. 84 years later, Columbus's ships crossed the same ocean, and the world decided, for the next 5 centuries, that the story began there. It did not begin there. It began on the northern tip of Newfoundland, in turf-walled rooms with iron slag floors and a single stone whorl sitting in the dirt. It began with a woman who packed for a future. It began with a chain of stepping stones stretching from Norway to Iceland to Greenland to a continent the old world barely understood was there. The Norse found America. The ice took everything they built, and when the silence finally broke, someone else got the credit. History is not written by the victors. It is written by whoever survives the cold. That question sits unresolved even now, not because we lack evidence, but because the full weight of what it means has not yet settled into the way we tell the story. A Native American woman's DNA is sitting in Icelandic families today, 1,000 years after she crossed the ocean. What happened to her? How did she get there? What did she make of the cold stone islands of the Norse world? What did the people of Iceland make of her? We do not know. We may never know. But she was real, and she crossed the Atlantic, and she left a mark that no amount of historical forgetting could erase. The ocean between worlds is smaller than it looks. It always has been. If this story reshaped how you think about history, please like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who want to see history told without the mythology. 2 videos are waiting for you right now. Both are queued up on your screen. The full story is still going. I hope you have a nice day.